John, welcome to the Club of Rome Rethinking Finance Hub. The purpose of this high-level consultation is to take a transdisciplinarity approach toward changing finance and financing change in the post-COVID era. And in order to go beyond the 5 to 10 minutes interventions where, you know, some of the most brilliant people in the world, you know, have to fire their ideas, we decided to go deeper and give you and others the opportunity to really take time to present the depth of your thinking and dig deeper into what should be done in order to take advantage of the amazing opportunity that we have today to shift existing systems. So the first question that I would like to ask you is, from your perspective, what can be done to jumpstart the economy in the post-COVID world?
Well, first, it's great to be with you, Marianne, and thank you for taking on this important task. And it's a privilege to be part of this really important conversation. You know, to answer that first question, I've been studying this idea of modern monetary theory for several years now, and have been able to speak with several of the leaders in that field. And for those who are not familiar with it, it's essentially the idea that governments that have their own domestic currencies can use them to stimulate demand much more than they realize, because we are living in this false narrative that governments are just like households and governments can't issue too much debt or they'll go bankrupt, when in fact the US government, being the best example because it's the global reserve currency, can issue as many dollars as it wants, because if it needs to pay back debt in dollars, it can always issue more dollars. And what made me, and of course it's counter to everything we believe is true, which is that it's irresponsible and reckless and we need to manage our fiscal house. But if you dive in and study it, you can learn that there's this accounting identity where the public sector and the private sector are in fact equally and offsetting each other. And the private sector generally moves toward a surplus, just like you and I want to have savings. We want to have savings for retirement. And we can't go into deficit indefinitely, because ultimately there comes time to pay the piper and the bank will come and take our house. And what the epiphany for me was that if that is true, and that the private sector needs to always be moving, at least in the long term, toward surplus, it means that the public sector has to be moving into a growing deficit. It's an accounting identity. And of course, if you extrapolate over a long period of time in a generally growing economy, that means the public sector deficit is going to grow indefinitely into the future. So this whole notion of we need to balance the budget is wrong. And the only question is, what's our degrees of freedom for how much we can use the public sector to actually stimulate the economy? So it's a long-winded way of saying that in a time like this crisis, there's no question in my mind that we need to utilize the public sector fiscal capacity in an unprecedented way, which of course is already happening. So, I mean, I'm running on a little bit here, but the point is that at a crisis like we're in now, really unprecedented in all of our lifetimes, we need to understand that particularly the major central banks of the world are the critical tool we need to use, and there's really no alternative. And so we need to understand what modern monetary theory tells us and utilize this capacity the way the central bank leaders of the world now understand.
So what would you tell, let's say, the EU Commission, which in my view is taking a lead on transforming economy toward a greener economy. If you had access to Ursula von der Leyen and her commissioners, what recommendations would you make them? What exactly should happen? For one, what monetary theory should they adopt? And the other, what economic system? You're an expert in yourself in this. What economic system is more conducive to the implementation of a Green Deal than today?
Well, you know, the European context is complicated because it is actually many countries who have given up their sovereign currencies. So the challenge of the European Central Bank acting on behalf of the European community is a unique challenge in the world. And that's probably a long conversation and a rabbit hole we don't want to go down. So if we can assume for a moment that the European Central Bank can behave as a central bank for the European Union, which is not a trivial assumption, but let's assume it can and will for a moment. I guess I would start with my general belief and framework is this idea that we're calling regenerative economics, and the simple idea of that is that human beings are living systems. We're not having this conversation unless our bodies are literally regenerating as we sit here. If we stop regenerating, we move into equilibrium, which means we're dead, we turn into dust. So we live in far from equilibrium. We don't live in equilibrium, which is the basis of conventional economic thinking. If humans are living systems, then I posit that the human economy is a living system itself. And if it is a living system, then logic would suggest if it's meant to be sustainable over a long period of time, it would follow the same patterns and principles of other living systems that have sustained themselves over long periods of time. What's remarkable is that those living systems principles are remarkably aligned with many of the wisdom traditions, particularly indigenous wisdom, that has stood the test of time. So for me, it's actually a quite simple proposition that if we want to get smart about how to organize and design our economies, the answer lies in nature. The answer lies in living systems. And I've laid out a framework for this in a paper I called Regenerative Capitalism. I use the word capitalism loosely because it's a reference to the multiple capitals. But the first step in shifting to a regenerative economy is to get clear on what the qualities or the principles or the patterns of living systems actually are. And I talk about 8 principles. Those aren't the right answers. Those are just my best way of articulating them. The key is to get clear on living systems principles and use those as a guide to our economic policy and changes that we need to make. So yes, I would encourage the European Commission to embrace what we generally refer to as a Green New Deal. That is certainly in alignment with how living systems principles will guide us. But there'll be many other clues that will surface out of using living systems principles as a guide that don't generally get discussed in the conventional conversation about Green New Deal.
So the EU Commission example was just an example for an organization that would theoretically be open to recommendations of this kind. So would you like to take us through the 8 tenets or 8 principles of regenerative economics or
sure,
capitalism?
If you'd like. It may take longer than you want. Maybe
Please.
I'll just go through a couple of them. Does that make sense?
Well, we do want to gather those ideas. This is the, if you can afford the time, if you
sure.
have it, yeah,
Sure.
please take us through all tenets. And because in the next round, we would like to gather in a larger group and come up with a recommendation or various recommendations as to what is it that what are the most sustainable ways of moving forward. No one really is in possession of truth. We can only, we're dabblers if you so wish, but right now, this is the brightest and the most advanced ideas that are out there. So please go ahead.
Okay, I will, I'll pull up a picture which will help guide the conversation. It'll just take me a quick second here.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to share the screen so you can share that if you want.
Do you want to, or I can do it from here, I think, no?
Well, you would have to do it. I hope you can.
I think I can do that. Bear with me one second. Here we go, share screen. There we go. Can you see that?
Yeah.
I'll make it bigger. Is that nice and big?
It was better before.
Oh, that better?
Yeah, if you go into the show mode, just run the application. Exactly. Yeah. The PowerPoint presentation. Yeah.
Yeah. But I put it on full screen before and you said it wasn't good.
Oh, maybe it was,
That's no good?
Okay, I don't know what is being recorded, to be honest, but let's do that. Yeah, should be okay.
Okay, so the 8 principles of a regenerative economy that I laid out in my 2015 paper are as follows. The first one is this idea of in-right relationship, meaning that all of the critical components of an economy need to be in symbiotic relationship with each other, win-win relationships, the way different animals and ecosystems in nature are in right relationship. And it begins really about, at the very macro level, the relationship between the planet and the sun is just right, or we wouldn't be alive. And it works all the way down to the cellular level, where at a cellular level, our bodies, our cells are in right relationship with each other, or we get sick. And one idea, just one example of how to use this in the context of our modern economics and the challenges we face in our current extractive capitalist system that I like to use is that the whole field of finance or sustainable finance revolves around or is largely built around this idea of environmental, social, and governance factors, ESG. And if we only had more transparent information about these ESG variables, then markets could do their job, investors would have better understanding and value companies differently. But that ignores the fundamental problem, which is that through the efficiency of capital markets, we've severed the relationship between real end investors, like pension funds, for example, and big public enterprises. And in fact, most of the secondary trading in public securities is now done in nanoseconds or months or even years. But the relationship between the end investors and the enterprise is really not a right relationship. It's really a transactional relationship. And much of the capital markets is really turned into a speculative casino. And so all of the ESG in the world isn't going to solve that fundamental breach of a principle, which is the relationship between one of the most important relationships in a private economy is the relationship between the owners and their enterprise. So that's one example of a problem that the principles highlight that without the principles we don't see. Another principle I talk about is, I call it, we need to view wealth holistically. Money is not equal wealth, and there's lots of work that's been done around the multiple capitals beyond financial capital. For example, relational capitals, natural capital, human capital, even spiritual capital, and that for a human economy to be healthy, we need to have a much more complex understanding of wealth than simply net present value of money. The next one is what I call innovative, adaptive, and responsive. All living systems must innovate and must adapt and must respond to change. We're seeing right now the urgency of adapting to the changes imposed by the COVID pandemic. And innovation, entrepreneurship is really at the heart of a healthy human economy. And so this principle is actually well understood in conventional thinking because of our general recognition of the importance of innovation and entrepreneurship. The next one I call empowered participation. The idea here is that all parts of the system need to be empowered to participate in the system. So this is an interesting way to think about the inclusion or the inequality issue. I would argue it's not just a moral issue, although it certainly is a moral issue, the grotesque inequality in our current economic system, but it's also a fundamental systemic health issue. If my feet are not empowered to participate in the circulation of oxygen in my body, not only is that bad for my feet, it's terrible for my feet, but it's also bad for the health of my whole system, my whole body, because if I can't use my feet, if I don't have feet, oxygen's not circulating there, I can't run, I can't walk, and that will make me unhealthy and not empowered to fulfill my potential as a human being. So the extension here to human economies is that it's not just a moral imperative to deal with this inequality, but the health of the whole system is suffering because, you know, a vast share of humanity is not actually actively participating and contributing to the health of the whole. The next principle I talk about is honors community and place. Living systems happen in place. The place of, you know, the East Coast of the United States is fundamentally a very different place than, for example, the Alps, and the economies of the Northeast United States where I live are going to be affected and not only affected, but driven by the realities of these geologic realities. Place is also where human culture and geological facts intersect. And so it's sort of intuitive that different places should have different economies influenced by the local cultures and as well as the geologic realities of these places. This sort of validates the move toward more place-based local economies. We like to think about bioregions as the scale, the appropriate scale to imagine economies in, as opposed to the unit of analysis being a nation state or the unit of analysis being a corporation. Imagine if we organized our economies around bioregions, we'd have a very different way of thinking about economy. The next one is what in living systems science is called the edge effect. I call it the edge effect abundance. And this is, there's massive diversity where different systems intersect with each other. For example, where a river meets an ocean, that's where diversity is greatest. That's where life happens. That's where danger exists. And that's where innovation happens. And so when we think about our human economy, the move toward the kind of monoculture of great big giant corporations scaling up the, you know, for example, a Walmart that scales up its stores and footprint in a monoculture across the country and across the world is the opposite of investing in the diversity at the edges of different systems. It may be more efficient, but it's certainly less resilient to have a monolith business model, and the edge effect is what exists in living systems, and we can apply that to our human economy as well. And there's all kinds of opportunities that arise when we work across edges that are naturally not thought of as we think about an economy organized by industry. Two more to go. The next one is what I call robust circulation. This is the idea of a metabolism. Any living system, by definition, has to have a healthy metabolism. And this is where climate change comes in. Climate change is actually not the problem. Climate change is a symptom of broken, healthy circulatory flow, the carbon cycle being out of balance with what is required. So for like any living system, robust circulation first requires healthy inputs. So for example, the public policy of austerity when an economy is already weak is in direct conflict with the essential need of robust circulation. And obviously it's not going to work and it doesn't work. In addition to that, there needs to be circulation throughout the system, just like our arteries move blood throughout our system. There's large arteries, medium-sized veins, and lots of small capillaries to move oxygen throughout our body. Similarly, we would want to see a similar fractal structure in any economic system and financial system to move vital nutrients, whether it's money or materials or information, throughout the system in a healthy way. And then finally, getting to climate change and the CO2 problem. Any healthy metabolism ensures that it doesn't deposit wastes into its own home in such a way that undermines the health of its home. So by pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and destroying our ability to sequester carbon because of our industrial agricultural system, we're ensuring that we're putting waste in our nest and just undermining our health in the process. But the key is that the principle is robust circulation. The principle is not CO2 emissions. And then finally, the last principle that I talk about in the paper is called seeks balance. This applies to many different things, from a balance of the masculine and the feminine to a balance of efficiency and resiliency. Turns out in living systems, they actually don't optimize efficiency the way our conventional economics would suggest. They actually find what is called a window of vitality, and this is based on empirical science. This is not anyone's opinion. They find this window of vitality that balances efficiency and resiliency. And so we're learning again from the COVID crisis what happens when we have a private sector driven economy that always is looking to optimize efficiency. We're left without enough ventilators, we're left without enough hospital capacity. And it's the same lesson we learned in the financial crisis a decade ago, where we had way too much quote unquote efficiency in the pursuit of return on capital and nowhere near enough resiliency in the financial system. And fortunately, we've taken important steps to resolve that, in particular by increasing the capital requirements of the banking sector. So that's a whirlwind tour of 8 principles. I hope that made some sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, you could now go back to share, looking at each other. Yeah, so my question is, I have several questions, yes, and thank you very much. It was very comprehensive. What is the measurement criteria when we go to metrics? We can only achieve what we measure. Right now we measure for profit only, as you already mentioned. How do you see these ideas, these 8 principles, or how many, being adopted and by existing financial systems? And how can we change the metrics, the measurements for success, in order to deliver?
Well, that's a great question. I wish I had a simple and complete answer. I would say that is a lot of work to be done. We have some colleagues at an organization called Blue Marble. They do evaluation work. And again, the first key is to understand that any evaluation or metric system needs to be holistic as opposed to reductionistic. And Blue Marble has a very holistic approach to it and takes a look literally, again, at a biosystem or a bioregional scale to understand how these measurements interact with each other. So I can't really respond in a concrete way, other than to say a couple things. One, the imperative that it be holistic. 2, I like to use the analogy of when you go to the doctor's office and you're trying to understand your own health. So you're a regenerative system, you go to a doctor, what do they measure? Well, they don't measure outcomes. They don't say, okay, why don't you go and run a 100-meter dash and let me measure how fast you run, and then I'll know how healthy you are based on how fast you run. The doctor will do something like measure your heart rate or measure your blood pressure, or take your blood sample and measure different nutrients and whatnot in your blood system. So these are indicators of health as opposed to outcomes that we measure. And a lot of the measurement conversation we have, whether it's alternative to GDP or impact investing metrics, they're all the outcomes we desire, which tell us whether we're making progress. So they're important, but they're not the indicators, they're not the forward-looking indicators of regenerative vitality, I would suggest. So for example, take one of the principles in right relationship. I have this idea that if we could get the data and measure economic transactions and give them a rating, you know, a +1 if they were in right relationship, where there was a symbiotic win-win outcome, and a 0 if it's unclear, and a -1 if they were clearly extractive. Imagine if we could capture that data on all the transactions in an economy or in a local economy. We would have a really valuable metric to measure A, how much alignment with that principle it is, and B, over time, whether it's moving more into alignment with that principle. And that will tell us, just conceptualizing such a measure tells us something really important about the financial system, because we know without measuring it that 99% of the stock market transactions are speculative in nature. And speculation implies one winner and one loser. Now, of course, it's not that simple. There is value in market making and liquidity. I get all that. But by and large, I don't think anyone who's a student of the public capital markets would argue or debate whether or not the capital markets have become predominantly a speculative activity. And speculation is not in alignment with right relationship. So that leads directly to a policy implication, which is that if we want a healthier capital market, it should be less speculative, not because I think speculation is bad, but because excess speculation violates one of the core principles of healthy living systems. Turns out Keynes knew this and wrote about it a long time ago, but we now have sort of an empirical reason to make that argument. And I could go through each of those 8 principles and come up with measurements that would assess how much in alignment with the principles they are. And that's the direction I think the measurement work needs to move, which isn't to say that measuring carbon emissions is not important. It is important. But what we really need to measure is whether we're moving toward a more healthy circulation, healthy metabolism in an economy. And there's lots of things we can do to measure that beyond just carbon emissions.
Yes, and so the next step would be, now that we have identified the theory and what should be done, how can we move toward policy and law? How can we ensure that we're being heard and that policy and the legislation are being put in place in order to implement those? So from your perspective, what should be, you know, the short, medium, and long-term interventions that our regulators, political, government, and so on, and legislation should do?
Well, you know, again, everything for me starts with getting this new narrative that the economy is a living system into the consciousness of the public. We live in a world where the political left and the political right argue with each other about how best to stimulate, in a sense, a mechanistic approach to growing this thing we call the economy. And of course, an exponentially growing economy indefinitely into the future, that itself is a metabolism of material throughput, energy and matter, is in conflict with the laws of physics. Obviously, the Club of Rome figured that out a long time ago with the critical work of limits to growth, but the world has not woken up to that idea yet. And so the most important thing to moving what I would call intelligent policy agenda to the forefront is to change this narrative about what the human economy is, and to reach broad-based buy-in into the idea that we need to understand it as a living system. And then we can argue and fight about how best to implement policies to steer it in alignment with the design principles and qualities of living systems. And I actually hope for the day that the left and the right are arguing with each other about the best policies to move us toward regenerative potential, as opposed to the best policies to drive us toward economic growth or undifferentiated economic growth. And where that growth occurs is really critical. Obviously, less developed economies are going to need capacity to grow in order to meet their basic needs, whereas well-developed economies are going to need to realize potential through many different means. But until there's an agreement that we are a living system and that we are embedded in a living system called planet Earth, then the policy arguments will kind of fall on deaf ears, because there isn't the fundamental understanding of what the goal is of the system. And, you know, I mean, Kate Raworth's donut is a beautiful, simplistic visual of the goal, particularly the planetary boundaries. Those are scientific. I mean, the science can debate a little bit around them, but there is a physical reality of planetary boundaries. I actually think we sometimes do ourselves a disservice to impose the social floors, because social floors, there are different value systems that would come, you know, we're not all going to agree on what the social floors would be. One person may think that, you know, no human being should be living on less than $100 a day. Another person may say no human being should live on less than $50 a day. But there are certain things that we can all agree on, and the planetary boundaries are kind of the non-negotiable physical realities. So, at any rate, you know, it's a long answer to your question, but I do have laid out in my finance paper what I think are kind of the 10 key policy implications of adapting this regenerative paradigm and seeing what it says for our financial system. So there are 10 policies that are specifically designed to transform the financial system into alignment with being in service of a regenerative economy.
So in the next iteration of this high-level consultation, we'll go in deeper into this. Can you give us like the top 3 policy decisions that would have to occur?
Sure. I'm trying to do it by memory. I think the first one that I talk about is just as I was referring to earlier, reduce speculation. I've been a long proponent of a financial transaction tax. That doesn't solve the problem, but it goes a very meaningful way to addressing that. I think a properly designed financial transaction tax would probably reduce the trading volumes in public stock markets in half, and that would scare a lot of people. But I would argue that would be that would do many things that would move the financial system or the stock market, public capital markets in a healthier direction. And the second one on my list is a massive reduction in leverage. If you think about financial leverage, it's done in the pursuit of efficiency in that case of the return on financial capital. And if you accept the principle of imbalance and what I described earlier as the window of vitality between efficiency and resiliency, if you look at the data, you actually see that the window of vitality is actually skewed toward resiliency, meaning it's not, the balance point is not in the middle of the two, it's actually skewed toward resiliency. Obviously, the COVID crisis puts this right in our face. If we don't understand the importance of resiliency now, you know, shame on us. And so for the financial system and therefore the economy to move from this hyper efficiency objective, which is, you know, driving our decisions on global supply chains, it's driving our decisions on capitalization of companies, capitalization of banks, the leverage of the entire leverage buyout industry is predicated on subsidizing debt. So the first thing we should do is take away the subsidies to debt. The interest deduction of the tax deduction of interest is in complete conflict with a desire to move toward a more resilient, less leveraged economy. But I would also want to impose penalties on businesses that take on excess leverage. And we need to argue about what excess leverage means, and it's going to be different for different industries. That's going to be complicated. But we should have carrots and sticks that move business enterprise toward a less efficient by design, more resilient by design capital structure. And that would mean way less leverage, and that would mean way less shocks to the system when something like COVID happens. The third one, I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I've read the paper, but I'll just make a general comment. It relates to the public sector. The thing that we misunderstand is we pretend that there's such a thing as a private sector in finance. There is no private sector in finance separate from the public sector. And again, the financial crisis drew that lesson home. The current economic crisis drives that lesson home. Were it not for the public sector, there would be no private sector of finance. And just when things are going well, that doesn't mean that now there's a private sector of finance. There's always this underlying, security blanket that is the public sector. And so I think we need to think about the regulatory response, the public policy framework, understanding that finance is inherently a public activity. And there's no reason why we allow individuals and firms to extract this public support system and extract value out of it for their own personal gains in the way we do, any more than we would think it's acceptable to allow a utility industry executive to take home $100 million in stock option compensation and bonuses, when in fact their entire industry is predicated on a public service that is underwritten by the public sector. So rethinking this line between the public and private sector, I think, is fundamental to reimagining a financial system that works. The other policies, they go into rethinking taxes, rethinking fiscal investments, fiscal priorities, experimenting with modern monetary theory, as I mentioned earlier. And the one that maybe I'll throw out to be provocative, I actually have written about this. If there's limits to growth, which those of us in the Club of Rome have signed up for that idea. Not that I'm defending GNP, but let's remember what GNP is. GNP equals consumption, which is the majority of the economy, plus investment, plus government spending, and plus net exports. So if there's limits to growth, that means there's also limits to investment and limits to consumption and limits to government spending. And from a financial point of view, let's think about the limits to investment. Every capital investment in the real economy uses up footprint. And so if we're already outside the footprint, take climate change, for example, we're at 410 parts per million or whatever, we need to be at 350. Every time someone decides to tear down a skyscraper and put up a taller one, which is happening all over the world, they're using up valuable footprint because there's an embedded energy in that initiative. If we had lots of footprint left, that's okay. But we now live in a world of finite boundaries. And so we actually need to have some public policy oversight and intervention in our capital investment decisions. Think of how crazy and radical that is. But there's no possible way around it. And in fact, Peter Victor has done some interesting work recently where he's written a paper that gets to this question of, if we're going to do just the energy transition we need, we're probably going to use up all of our footprint just on that, which means we need to curtail consumption and curtail non-critical investment to create the room to do the energy transition. And yet no one in public policy is even thinking about that kind of a challenge at this point. So the last point in my paper recommends a capital investment board, which it would be a body that would actually review large capital investments, not small ones, just the biggest ones, and assess whether it was in alignment with, as you said, as we started, the objectives of, say, a Green New Deal.
Wow, wonderful. That's right along. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. So what you just said presupposes or requires a mind shift.
Mm-hmm.
Can you?
That's why I think the narrative is so key. Because
Yeah.
imagine you and I walking into, pick your government official of choice and arguing we need a capital investment review board.
It ain't happened.
Not going to happen. So we need the narrative first.
Okay. So, okay. And how do we create that narrative that is short and in line with the short attention span of the thinking in politics? If
you and I knew the answer to that, we would have done it 10 years ago, I suppose. I mean, that's the human civilization question of the moment. And I think one challenge is that we in the kind of new economy, regenerative economy, whatever you want to call it, domain, are not the natural storytellers. And unfortunately, the natural storytellers are invested in the marketing departments of multinational corporations, and they're in Hollywood. And so probably the answer to the question is we need to capture the imagination and skills of the genius storytellers of society. And maybe it's not a story, maybe it's a game. I've envisioned an interactive game that would allow people to see the regenerative economy emergent in the real world. Because there's tons of examples of regenerative initiatives. They're just invisible to the mainstream. So imagine if you had a game where they all became visible, and then you could add to them. But that's not my skill set. And I think collectively we need to figure out how to attract the genius storytellers. Imagine if we could bring, I don't know, the top 10 acclaimed storytellers of our societies into a room and lock them up for a week until we explain to them what we understand about economies and living systems, and then challenge them to create the ultimate new narrative of our age, the new story. People have been talking about this for a long time. Thomas Berry said, decades ago, we're in trouble because the old story no longer works and we lack a new story. So a lot of people are working on this challenge, but it's not easy it's not easy for humans to change paradigms, just as Dana Meadows pointed out in her famous Leverage Points paper.
Right. So, but we do have pressure, and COVID-19 has increased that pressure. And we're now, as we can see, we see the science fighting with belief systems. If the sky was there was no limit, or the sky was the limit, with whom should we partner? Who are the key people that we should be bringing to the table in order to make that transition?
Well, first you make a great point, which is that the pressure is rising, and systems change in response to pressure, and systems don't change without pressure. One of my teachers, Sally Gorner, always liked to say, if you put a pot of water on the stove and turn up the heat, eventually it'll boil. And without the heat, it doesn't change. It's no different for human economies. So between the financial crisis, between 9/11, the financial crisis, all of the climate change crises that are rolling out literally on a daily basis, and now this COVID crisis, the pressure is rising, the inequality crisis, we could go on and on. That's the most hopeful. As hard as that all is, it's the only reason I'm confident the system will change, because the pressure is rising. you know, in terms of who we need in the room, you know, I go to Cameron, the filmmaker. I mean, we need a Cameron, we need a Spielberg, we need whoever it is that has had a shift in consciousness and gets this, and has the modern storytelling genius capability. We need those people in the room, and probably it should be a woman, because this new story is a feminine story, not a masculine, you know, domineering story. So it's probably a woman.
Or a feminine energy, I'd rather
Or a
like
feminine
to say.
energy.
Because
Yeah.
it's not about men or women. We have
Right.
these energies in both of us, and it's just, you know, what needs to come to the forefront right now is probably the feminine energy in both of us. So
very well said. Very well said.
And I know you've been very generous with your time. We only have a few minutes left. And as you know, I'm a computer scientist and AI expert, and I just love technology. And the question to you, how do you see the role, exponentially growing technologies and entrepreneurship play a role in this transition in the future?
That's a key question. I'm not an expert in technology. In fact, people that know me would say that I'm a technology problem magnet. But in all seriousness, I think technology has such a vital role to play, and yet our history with technology, and I'll speak for myself as a former derivatives specialist, you know, the derivatives technology was the most innovative thing to happen in finance in a long, long time. And I rode that wave and was the kind of young hotshot, and, you know, had no conception of how wrong and how badly it could be abused, and where that would lead to ultimately in the mortgage fiasco. So, and, you know, and social media and what's happened with Facebook is probably, you know, exponentially more dangerous to human civilization. So we have to be humble and recognize that technologies are just tools, and there needs to be a moral, ethical framework, and I would argue a living systems economy framework that we use to harness and put a guardrail around our use of technology. Just because we invent something doesn't mean we necessarily should use it. With that proviso, I do think that big data and artificial intelligence, and obviously connected on the, you know, the internet is a beautiful example of robust circulation, right? So that the internet as a tool is completely aligned with my living systems principles. We not only circulate energy and materials, but we now circulate information and increasingly empathy. You know, the circulation of photographs is kind of like moving from information to empathy. So there's huge potential if we use these tools correctly. If we monetize them to try to sell us more stuff that we don't need, that's a disaster. And of course, or much less monetize them to manipulate our elections, that's a disaster. So again, how we use the tools is critical. But if you go back to your question earlier about metrics, and if I'm right, or even roughly right, that we need to start measuring things that we don't yet even begin to capture in conventional statistics, and that data is much more granular than top-down things like employment and incomes, but it's much more granular. Like, you know, example I like to use is, if I'm going to put a new driveway in my house, it matters whether I put down tar, blacktop, or gravel, because one is good for the environment and one is bad for the environment. Well, how the hell are we going to capture that level of granular data without some involvement of big data, distributed data, and artificial intelligence to make sense of what's happening? So the challenge for the technologists in the world, in my opinion, is to first become literate in this idea of living systems, And then the applications to understand how to measure both the ecological health of living systems and the implications of the human footprint on ecological systems is the biggest opportunity in the history of technology. And I'm not smart enough to know how to do that, but there are a lot of people working on that already. And combining that with new monetary systems of exchange, new banking systems that encourage investment into things we need and discourage investment into things we don't need is the next 50 years of our life, I believe. And the biggest opportunity for the technologists in the history of humanity, because the consequences and the implications are so profound. And so my hope is that the computer science engineers work on these problems rather than figuring out the next app that I don't need on my phone.
Yeah, which I couldn't agree more, which basically we're saying that we need to join forces and share the same narrative that we also subscribe to, so that we see that we're on one Earth and one universe, one planet.
Absolutely. And I believe there's at least a significant subset, if not a majority, of young computer scientists who, if they, they probably are more aware of this than our generation. And if they see an opportunity to work on it, they will jump at it. But right now, the opportunities are to go work in some of these behemoth tech companies, and and figuring out how to write the next algorithm to get people to vote a different way, or to get people to spend money that they don't need to spend. So it's again, and same with Wall Street. We need people who want to go to work in finance to finance this transition, rather than to figure out the best way to write an algorithm to speculate in the stock market on a nanosecond by nanosecond basis. So it's a massive misallocation of human talent and human genius.
Wonderful. The sun has joined you again. And so, but we've come to the end of the first part of this consultation. Thank you so very much for your extraordinary insights and for sharing your wisdom with us. And we'll be in touch.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to the next chapter.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, John.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.